In the late summer of 1882, a man named Frank Hamilton Cushing sat in the house of the rain priest at Zuni Pueblo and wrote down what he was hearing for the third time that week. Cushing was 25 years old. He had arrived in Zuni 3 years earlier as a staff ethnologist for the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, part of an expedition led by James Stevenson, and had simply stayed when the expedition left, persuading his supervisors by letter that residency would produce what a visit of several weeks could not. By 1882, he spoke Zuni well enough to follow ceremonial speech, had been inducted into a warrior society, wore Zuni dress as a matter of daily practice rather than performance, and sat in conversations that no outside researcher had previously been permitted to hear. The rain priest that afternoon was perhaps 60 years old, and had been speaking for most of the afternoon about the mines to the southwest. Not the mines as a source of turquoise, the mines as a place where something had been left, deliberately, by people whose name in Zuni oral tradition placed them several generations before the oldest remembered ancestor. The word Cushing wrote in the margin of his field notebook, and set apart and circled, the way a careful observer marks the thing that refuses to be filed under any category he already has, translates as either rooms or held spaces, depending on who renders the Zuni. The rain priest, Cushing noted, found the distinction important. These were not collapsed shafts. They were rooms that had been sealed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The mines the rain priest was describing sit in a cluster of low hills roughly 25 miles southwest of present-day Santa Fe, in a district the Spanish had recorded as Las Minas de Chalchihuitl since the early 1600s, the mines of green stone, a name that acknowledges a use far older than the Spanish arrival. The Zuni and the other Pueblo peoples of the region had been extracting turquoise from those hills for a period that no survey has fully bracketed. Archaeological material pulled from the uppermost accessible levels during examinations in the early 1900s included obsidian tools whose source material had been quarried from outcroppings more than 100 miles away, which means the traffic moving toward those mines was once substantial enough to justify long-distance trade in the raw materials needed to work them. Turquoise from the Cerrillos district has been recovered at Chaco Canyon, at Mesa Verde, and at sites in present-day Mexico, which means these hills were, for an extended period, among the most consequential extraction points in the continent. The deepest sections of the principal shaft have not been reached by any documented excavation. The tool marks on the walls of the lower sections, seen by 3 separate researchers across 3 separate decades in the 1800s, have not been matched to any catalogued implement type, from the region or from any neighboring region. That detail is not speculation. It is what 3 trained observers each wrote down independently, without knowledge of what the others had noted. Cushing was not the first researcher with a professional obligation to record his observations to find something at those mines that his existing categories would not accommodate. In 1846, a United States Army topographical engineer named William Hemsley Emery moved through the Cerrillos Hills as part of Stephen Kearny's Army of the West during the survey of the newly acquired Southwestern Territory. Emery was practical by training and professional obligation. His official notes describe the primary pit openings in measured terms, record the scale of the extraction as far exceeding what any documented contemporary population could have produced, and note that the precision of the upper shaft walls does not correspond to the tool types his survey associated with the region's pre-Spanish inhabitants. He wrote the measurement down and kept moving. That was the limit of his commission. Adolph Bandelier arrived in New Mexico in 1880, commissioned by the Archaeological Institute of America to survey the ruins and oral traditions of the Pueblo region, and visited the Cerrillos Hills in the autumn of 1882, within a matter of weeks of Cushing's sessions with the rain priest. Bandelier's journals from that visit, held in a Santa Fe archive, describe the principal shaft opening at roughly 40 feet across, with vertical walls of white feldspar and quartz, standing clear on 3 sides. Below the first descent, the workings branched, and the branches were not fully accessible because decades of debris accumulation had made the lower passages dangerous without equipment Bandelier had not brought. He measured what he could reach and recorded it. Then he noted, in his private journal, that one section near the midpoint of the primary shaft had been walled off. The wall was not slump material or collapsed ceiling. It was built, fitted stone, set in a deliberate course, blocking the passage. He recorded the approximate dimensions and noted that the stone used in that wall did not match the surrounding formation, meaning it had been carried to the site from somewhere else. That entry is in the private journal and not in the report Bandelier submitted to the Archaeological Institute. Whether the omission was his decision, or whether a reviewer made the choice before the report was circulated, is not something the surviving correspondence resolves. What circulated was the report. What stayed in a box was the journal. What Cushing's notes added to that physical record was the account of someone who had spent 3 years learning what the Zuni said in the rooms where that knowledge was kept. The rain priest's account of the chambers beneath the mines accumulated across several sessions in the summer of 1882, not from a single conversation, and the physical details it contained were consistent across every session. The priest described chambers that ran not in the direction of the ore body but toward the east, toward the nearest reliable water source. He described walls that had been worked smooth, not by the abrasion that produces a natural cave surface, but by a deliberate process that left a uniform face. And he described a final chamber that held what he called, in the rendering Cushing labored over, things placed rather than things found. The distinction in Zuni speech was between an object left by someone who intended to return and an object abandoned. The priest was clear on which category applied. A second elder, whose name appears in Cushing's notes by the title Kiapque, which Cushing translated as one who holds a passage, described the same site in terms that aligned with the rain priests on the physical details and diverged on one point. Kiapque said the chambers had been closed from the inside. He said this as a statement about construction, not history, and Cushing, who had learned to separate those two registers in Zuni speech, marked the distinction in his notes. Kiapque placed the construction in a period that in Zuni oral categories referred to the people who preceded the ancestral Pueblo builders, whose own ruins were already ancient when the Zunis' remembered history began. He was describing something older than the oldest name in the tradition. He said the rooms held what had been placed there deliberately, and that the people who closed them from the inside knew what they were doing. Cushing underlined that sentence. The question of what lies at the end of those sealed passages became, for a period of roughly 3 years, a practical rather than a theoretical matter. In 1889, the American School of Classical Studies, operating out of a research station in Santa Fe, dispatched a small survey team to the Cerrillos Hills in response to a recommendation from Washington Matthews at the Bureau of American Ethnology, who had reviewed Cushing's 1882 field notes and judged them significant enough to warrant physical follow-up. The team was led by George Dorsey. He was 23 years old, had not yet completed his doctoral degree, and would go on to spend nearly 30 years as the curator of anthropology at the Field Museum in Chicago. Dorsey arrived in October of 1889 with a glass plate camera, measuring equipment, and 2 Pueblo guides who had grown up within a day's travel of the site. He spent 11 days there. The upper workings he documented thoroughly. His photographs of the principal pit opening show a shaft cut to a depth he estimated at 60 feet in the accessible section, with tool marks on the upper walls that he described in his field notes as requiring a harder instrument than any stone implement he had examined from the region. He measured the primary shaft across at 42 feet, consistent with Bandelier's earlier figure. He photographed the walled section Bandelier had recorded in his private journal, and his photographs showed the coursed stone face clearly, rectangular blocks not native to the surrounding formation, set in a dry-laid course with joints he described as dressed, meaning cut to fit, with a precision that demanded a controlled process rather than expedient stacking. His field notes for the first 7 days are detailed, organized, and dated in his hand. The handwriting is consistent throughout, the measurements cross-checked in the margins, the observations arranged in the order a trained surveyor uses, physical description, then measurement, then anomaly. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. On the 8th day, he descended into the lower section with both guides and a rope. His formal report to the American school, submitted in February of 1890, runs to 41 pages. It describes the upper workings in terms consistent with his field notes, recommends continued excavation, and calls the site among the most significant evidence of prehistoric extraction in the continent. It does not describe the lower section. The field notebook covering those 3 days in the lower shaft has not been located in any archive associated with the American School, the Field Museum, or any of the institutions that received Dorsey's professional papers after his death in 1931. His records from every other southwestern survey he conducted across the 1880s and 90s are catalogued and complete. The Cerrillos notebook is the one gap in a run that spans nearly a decade. In November of 1889, between his return from the site and the submission of his formal report, Dorsey wrote a letter to Frederick Ward Putnam, the curator of Harvard's Peabody Museum and the most influential figure in American archaeology at that period. Putnam was 48 years old, had overseen more southwestern research than any other institutional figure of the decade, and was the man a young researcher would write to when he did not know what to do with what he had found. Dorsey's letter, preserved in Putnam's professional papers at Harvard's archive, describes 3 days spent in the lower section. It does not describe what those 3 days contained. It describes Dorsey's uncertainty about what to write in the formal report. Putnam's reply has not survived. What Dorsey did in the following decade behaves consistently with someone who had made a decision about a subject and then moved on from it. He published substantial work on the Hopi and the Arapaho through the Field Museum series in the 1890s, built his reputation on ceremony and material culture, and conducted surveys across the Southwest that filled in the catalogued record on dozens of sites. He did not return to the Cerrillos Hills, and his published correspondence contains no further reference to the site, to the sealed lower section, or to what the walled passage might have contained. A researcher who spent 3 days underground and then reorganized his career around other subjects is not a data point that proves anything. But it is a data point. The Zuni oral tradition, in the same years Dorsey was building his Field Museum record, was consistent on the subject of those mines in a way that the academic literature was not. Matilda Cox Stevenson, the wife of James Stevenson, and a researcher of considerable independent ability who worked with Zuni women and children across the same years as Cushing, recorded a ceremonial category in her notes that she rendered in English as the keepers of the lower places. Her papers, donated to the Smithsonian after her death in 1915, describe this as a hereditary office maintained across generations by specific families within the Zuni community, families responsible for preserving knowledge of physical locations that were not to be entered without ceremony, and whose contents were not to be described to those outside the office. The Turquoise mines at the Cerrillos Hills were among those locations. She does not record what the keepers knew about what those locations held. She notes that she was not permitted to record it. The physical characteristics that Bandelier and Dorsey described separately in the lower Cerrillos workings, the worked smooth walls, the built stone passage seal, the eastward orientation away from the ore body, also appear in the records of other ancient sites across the Pueblo region from the same decade of surveys. In 1878, a researcher named Victor Mindeleff surveyed the Great House at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon as part of the Bureau of American Ethnology's initial systematic work in the canyon. His survey notes describe sealed lower chambers beneath the primary structure that, when opened for examination, showed no sign of the casual debris that accumulates in abandoned rooms. The floors were clean, the walls were intact. They had not been left, they had been closed. Mindeleff wrote that distinction into his survey record and kept moving, and it was Mindeleff's own older brother Cosmos who submitted the formal Chaco report, which does not revisit the observation. At Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, James Stevenson's survey in 1881, conducted as part of the same Bureau of American Ethnology program that had sent Cushing to Zuni, described sealed rooms at the base of the White House ruin whose orientations did not align with the primary construction axis of the structure above them. Stevenson measured the angular deviation and recorded it without explanation. The formal report notes the anomaly once and moves past it. The sealed rooms were opened and found empty. Whatever empty meant in that context, whether it meant stripped of contents, cleaned deliberately, or simply cleared in the way the Cerrillos chambers were described as cleared, the report does not say. Two sites with the same characteristic, described by different researchers working independently within 4 years of each other, is a pattern that could be coincidence. 3 sites, documented in 3 separate institutional programs across a single decade, is a pattern that requires a different kind of attention. The Rain Priest's account in 1882 described rooms whose walls had been worked to a surface that no natural process produces, whose contents had been placed by someone who intended the placement to persist, and whose closing had been done from the inside. That last detail is what careful researchers reach for in the way Cushing reached for his pencil when Kyapque said it. A natural cave mouth can be sealed from the outside. A structural room can be sealed from the outside. Sealing from the inside requires that whoever did the closing did not come back out through the same passage. The Rain Priest and Kyapque described that as a deliberate act, not an accident. The design of the closure was part of the intention. The Cerrillos Hills are now within a New Mexico state park. The primary shaft opening has been fenced, and the upper portions filled for visitor safety, which means the surface is accessible and the depth is not. The built wall that Bandelier described in his private journal, and that Dorsey photographed in 1889, has not been formally examined since. The lower section that cost Dorsey 3 days, and a letter to Frederick Putnam, has not been entered since, or if it has, the entry has not produced a published record. The heritage of the Pueblo peoples whose ancestors cut those shafts is acknowledged in the interpretive materials at the park. The shafts themselves are fenced. Matilda Cox Stevenson's keepers of the lower places maintain their office across generations because specific knowledge needs a specific carrier. The knowledge they kept was about physical locations, not myth. It was about where the rooms were and what they held, and why the holding mattered. That office may still exist within the Zuni community in some form or under some other name. A hereditary knowledge-keeping role does not dissolve when the institution that tried to record it moves on to other subjects. The academic literature does not know what the current state of that knowledge is, because the academic literature has not been permitted to record it, which is itself part of the record. Emery measured the scope of those workings in 1846 and kept riding. Bandelier found a built wall inside the shaft in 1882 and kept it in his journal rather than his report. Dorsey went down into the lower section in 1889 and came back up and wrote a letter describing his uncertainty, and his field notebook for those 3 days is the only gap in a decade of otherwise complete records. The Rain Priest said the rooms were sealed. Kyapque said they were sealed from the inside. Cushing wrote both of those things down and underlined one of them, and his notes have been in the Smithsonian archive for over 100 years, and the lower section of the Cerrillos shaft has been fenced. Whatever the Rain Priest meant by held spaces is still holding. The word Cushing, circled that afternoon in 1882, was not rooms in the sense of empty space. It was rooms in the sense of a space that continues to do something. That is a distinction that matters in Zuni speech, and Cushing, who had spent 3 years learning that, set it apart and drew a circle around it, and did not go back and cross it out. The mines are where they were, the hills are where they were, and 3 days of a careful man's field notes have been missing for 135 years, which is either the most unremarkable archival gap in the history of southwestern research, or it is exactly what a blank looks like when the blank is the record. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.